continuando con las presentaciones de este segundo bloque, que tiene como objetivo analizar y profundizar sobre la gobernabilidad para la regeneración urbana, para lo cual vamos a tener el honor de tener dentro de los expositores de este congreso a quien fuera uno de los principales promotores de este tema. Me refiero a Mr. Ken Livingstone, el primer mayor de Londres. Lo hemos invitado a que nos exponga sobre la creación de la Greater London Authority, las competencias y también las prioridades, el rol de esta autoridad en la recuperación de sectores obsoletos y herramientas de gestión. El señor Livingstone fue alcalde de Londres entre los años 2000 y 2008, convirtiéndose en el primero en ocupar ese puesto luego de la creación de lo antes mencionado, el Greater London Authority. Durante su mandato se ganó la confianza de la ciudadanía al plantear una visión clara para el área metropolitana e implementar así programas e inversiones con énfasis en el mejoramiento del transporte y los espacios públicos, impulsando al mismo tiempo la revitalización de sectores degradados. Con preocupación por el cambio climático, implementó la tarificación vial en el centro de Londres y otras iniciativas tendientes a reducir la congestión y, por supuesto, también la contaminación. Fue determinante la gestión que derivó en la organización de los Juegos Olímpicos de 2012, conduciendo el Olympic Park Legacy Corporation, gracias al cual hoy un barrio antiguamente periférico y deteriorado de Londres acoge un desarrollo mixto con instalaciones deportivas, áreas verdes, viviendas y equipamiento, reconocido como referente a nivel global. Con el aplauso de ustedes recibimos al señor Ken Livingstone.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This is my first visit to Chile, and so far it has been an absolute pleasure. I want to concentrate really because nothing that we've heard so far this morning I disagree with. There's a consensus there backed by research and facts. So I largely want to talk about my experience and what I learned from it. Because although I was mayor from 2000 to 2008, I was also leader of the Greater London Council in the early 1980s, and I first was elected to one of the local authorities in London back in 1971. And I wouldn't be here today if local government and national government had continued the policy which had then been running since the end of the Second World War. The debates you hear about density, the resistance that many people have, that they don't want a new development in their local area, the sort of what we call NIMBYism, not in my backyard. The whole of the first 30 years after the Second World War, the policy, both of Conservative and Labour governments and Conservative and Labour councils, was to reduce London's population. At the start of the Second World War, 8.5 million people lived in London. A lot in incredible squalor, terrible slums, families living one to a room, shared toilets. And towards the end of the war, the government, the coalition government under Churchill, commissioned a man called Abercrombie to draw up a strategy for London for the rest of the century. And all parties supported that. His conclusion was that over the period from 1945 to 1990, London's population should be reduced to 5 million people, and both people and jobs should be moved out of London to new little satellite towns where they would live in better conditions. And that policy was followed right up until 1974, 73, 74. And along with that, if you're reducing the population of a great world city like that, it opened up also the prospect of shifting towards, from public transport to a car-owning democracy. And the plans were to demolish tens of thousands of homes, bring all the great motorways, like the M1 and the M23, into the centre of London, where are three great ringways. The inner one at Hyde Park, running down to just the south of the Thames. Three great ringways inside London, and another one, the M25, just outside. And once again, this was a policy supported by all parties. Mrs. Thatcher once famously said, if you see a man over 30 on a bus, you know he's a failure. And the idea was, reduce the population, everyone in a car. I was elected to the Greater London Council in 1973, just at the time we realised this policy was catastrophic. Moving jobs and people out of the city was turning London into a failing city, declining in economic terms. And so at that election in 1973, we were committed to stopping that policy and doing away with these plans of massive motorways coming into the city. We were committed to a major municipal house building programme and cutting the fares to attract people back onto public transport. And it shouldn't have been difficult for people to understand that building roads doesn't solve your transport problem. Back in the 1930s in New York, Mayor LaGuardia commissioned Robert Moses to build a great new motorway in order to solve the problem of congestion on the streets of New York. It was believed that would solve the problem for a decade. But that first motorway was built, it was congested within 3 months. They built two more during the 1930s. They were all congested within months of opening. I think there's a simple fact. The more road space you create, the more people will turn to their cars and fill it up. So that was what underlay our policy at that stage. Our problem was that just a few months after our election in 1973, the Saudis led their dominance on OPEC to increase oil prices by 400%, fueling inflation around the world and destroying much of the manufacturing industries in the Western world. And the response of governments was, of course, major cuts in public spending as they struggled to cope with the increasing burden of debt as inflation was fueling massive increases in interest rates. So by the time I became the leader of the GLC in 1981, Mrs. Thatcher had been in power for 2 years. Her first policy was to reduce public sector investment from 5% of GDP to 1%. So there was no prospect of a major expansion of our infrastructure, and we used cutting the fares as a way of getting people back onto public transport. We were in the height of Mrs. Thatcher's first recession. Unemployment was 3 million. So we actually had empty seats on our underground trains, and the fares cut we produced led to a big influx of people switching from their cars to public transport because it saved them money. Mrs. Thatcher and her supporters thought this was an outrageous move back towards state intervention. The most right wing of our papers, the Daily Mail, on the day we cut the fares, said this is the first step towards the introduction of a full Soviet economy, which I think was a slight overstatement. And within a few years, Mrs. Thatcher just decided to abolish our regional government. So from 1986 until 2000, there was no regional authority. We had 32 little boroughs, each pursuing their own policy. And when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, there was a consensus that London was failing. in the mayoral election, big business was saying to all the candidates, if you can't solve London's congestion problem, we are thinking of relocating to Paris or Brussels or somewhere else. And we had a terrible problem of congestion. So even if you were very rich and had a wonderful expensive car, you were still locked into traffic jams in the centre. And as I say, London was seen as a city that was failing and declining. I was lucky in the sense that I came to power in 2000 at a time when the Labour government was increasing public spending, and we made a very strong case for increasing investment. And that was based on the work I'd done as an MP, because between the abolition of the GLC and the creation of the mayoralty, I was a member of Parliament. I felt, actually, in retrospect, the least productive years of my life. But I concentrated on trying to understand what led to economic success. And my conclusion is that it is investment. This is now taken as absolute by economists. At the moment, the consensus is amongst economists that 51% of all the growth in the economy of the USA has been fueled by investment. 57% of all the growth in China over the last 30 years has been fueled by investment. And I think if you look at the history of Britain, how on earth could a nation which had just 2% of the world's population become the dominant global power for a century? The interesting thing is we were the first nation in human history to invest 7%, both public and private, of our wealth. In the period after its Civil War, America, by the end of the 19th century, was investing 19% of its wealth, both public and private, and laying the foundation for their dominance of the 20th century. West Germany led Europe out of the Second World War with a major economic growth, and in its best year in 1973, was investing 25% of its GDP. Japan leapt to being the second largest economy in the world in the late 1960s. Its best year, it invested 38% of its GDP. And China, of course, is investing 47%. And I think that's important to understand, because over this last 35 years since the election of Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, with their neoliberal agenda about winding down the state and pulling the state back from regulation, reducing taxes and so on, there's been an assumption that those policies have been a great success. As Mrs. Thatcher came to power, we were investing 5.5% of our national wealth in public infrastructure, most of it in housing. She cut it to 1%. Courageously, Tony Blair raised it to 1.5%. But Gordon Brown, faced with the banking crisis, increased our investment to 3.5% of GDP. And at the point when he lost the election, we were achieving quite strong growth and recovering from the banking crisis. Unfortunately, the Cameron government that was elected immediately cut investment back to 1% and helped to tip us back into another painful recession. And why do politicians concentrate their public spending cuts in investment? It's because there's no immediate pain. If you make your cuts in public expenditure in your revenue budget, it affects the health service, the education service, pensions, welfare. There's immediate anger. If you just stop investing in infrastructure, it's 5, 10, or even more years down the road before the pain of that decision has its impact. So broadly, it's a cowardly act, but it's one that politicians of all parties seem to be attracted to. If you look instead at the impact of public sector investment, you only need to look at London. As I say, when I became mayor, London was seen as failing. Clearly, major infrastructure takes a long time to build. So the way to do something quickly to tackle our congestion was to improve our bus system and to actually introduce the congestion charge. To introduce a congestion charge without improving your public transport would be very unfair on the poorest. So I froze fares on the buses for 4 years. We got rid of an old bus fleet of 5,500 over 5 years and replaced it with 8,000 new buses. We got away from the nonsense of paying in cash as you get on the bus and introduced a smart card system, as I think you have here. And in the 15 years since then, bus ridership has increased by 75%. And when we introduced the congestion charge, the number of cars coming into the centre of London was reduced by 40%, and the pollution in the centre of London was cut by 15%. And it was seen as a policy that worked. But there were other factors. It's not just, as I was lobbying to get investment in building things like Crossrail, you also want private sector investment to increase. And we had a problem in London. Each of those 32 little boroughs had its own planning regulations, different restrictions on density and height. Any of you who have been to the Emirates Stadium in Islington will see it's quite remarkable. The only football stadium in the world with a concave roof. And of course, a concave roof means when it has heavy rain, it floods the pitch. So the developer had to spend £5 million on a drainage system in the concave roof in order to avoid that. And you have to ask, why would somebody want to do this? It was because in Islington they had a rule. No building could ever be more than 30 metres high. And each of these boroughs had their own rules on density and height. And I made a promise when I was running for mayor that if elected mayor, I would abolish all restrictions on height and density and instead have a planning policy based on the quality of the individual development that was being brought forward. And this unleashed a real wave of private sector investment. We had very few tall buildings in London. Now in the centre we've had 15 years of massive investment in new construction, things like the Shard and many others. And broadly, it's been a success. Not everyone agrees that each of the buildings looks attractive, but that's a personal issue. The other thing that Tony Blair did in creating the mayoral system was not just give the mayor the power to make these major planning decisions, but a rule, the mayor had to make a decision within 2 weeks, 14 days. So what tended to happen was developers would come to me, and there's an immediate flood of developers to see me in the first 8 weeks after I took office, saying, we want to build, like Irving said, so I'd like to build this Shard. Will you give permission? And I said, almost certainly yes. And they would then go back and start to spend the money necessary to work that scheme up. And we had an involvement between my planning officers and the developers at each stage. And it's been incredibly successful. The boom in both public investment, when we decided to bid for the Olympics, we couldn't make a credible bid without spending £3 billion to upgrade our public transport system, building a light rail system massively around the Olympic site. And what I found interesting I was given permission by the government to go to the bond markets to borrow that 2.9 billion. The flood of interest, I could have borrowed 12 billion. It was an overwhelming desire by the bond markets to lend money for projects like that. And of course, we had a similar influx, £8 billion of investment around the Olympic site. And still today, we're seeing major new office construction and housing construction around that site, which previously was the most polluted and underutilised land anywhere, not just in London, but in southern England. And London went from being seen as a failing city to overtaking New York on ratings by 2007. And we went from, because I say the policy was to manage London's population down. By the end of the 1980s, it had gone down from 8.5 million to just over 6.5 million, perhaps 6.75. It had started to pick up. It was almost 7 million when I became mayor in 2000. It's now 8.6 million, and we are expecting it to be 10 million by 2030. So London's been transformed on the back of improving our public transport system, but also making it easier for the private sector to actually invest. Sadly, my successor put a stop to all the projects that we were working up, except the bike hire scheme. But now, after 7 years of not starting new infrastructure projects, we're starting to see a real problem of congestion in central London. We're facing a major housing crisis. And I have to say he has started to bring back some of the projects that he put on hold when he became the mayor. But the mayor that will be elected next year, in 7 months, will have to move very fast to get a major new programme of infrastructure, or there will be, once again, firms starting to say this city isn't working. It's quite possible to do that. Our two biggest immediate problems are housing crisis, which has become enormous, and air quality, because I know you haven't made this mistake here in Chile, but across Europe, over the last 20 years, people have switched from petrol to diesel, and the pollution that comes from the nitrous oxides and the particulates is now causing in London nearly 10,000 deaths a year. So each year, 3 times the fatalities that we saw in 9/11. And whoever is mayor is going to have a further big shift out of cars and into public transport, or a move towards electric vehicles. So this brings me to this key issue about what makes a successful city. It's that question of getting public sector investment by the state and also private sector investment. And as I say, over the last 35 years, the neoliberal agenda has just been that basically anything the state does is bad, it should all be switched to the private sector. And I watched both Thatcher and Blair try to achieve that. And particularly Tony Blair came up with private finance initiatives. We'd get the private sector to build things that the state used to build. In particular, we have hospitals all over the country that the private sector built, but it ends up costing us 4 to 6 times more than if the state had just built them. Basically, you end up leasing the hospitals for 30 years at a very high price. But the most spectacular failure of trying to persuade the private sector to do the investment that the public sector should do was on the modernisation of our underground. Basically, for decades, the old tube had started to run down. They hadn't invested in new signalling systems, new track, or new trains. And so Tony Blair and Gordon Brown decided to create a private public partnership, as they called it, in which the tube, the maintenance and the upgrading of the underground would be transferred to 2 private sector consortiums on a 30-year contract. One, the largest, was led by Balfour Beatty, 5 firms coming together, including our energy firm EDF and Thames Water. The other was led by the American firm Bechtel. And they were given 30-year contracts. The contracts were 1 million words long. The contracts filled 2 4-drawer filing cabinets. And the simple fact is, Balfour Beatty and Bechtel can always employ much cleverer lawyers and accountants than you have inside our civil service, so we were completely ripped off. But they turned out to be a disaster. Balfour Beatty and its consortium decided to award all the work for upgrading the underground to the 5 firms in this consortium. No competition from any contract. Bechtel put all the work out to tender and did better. But these contracts started in 2003, but by 2007, the Balfour Beatty consortium came to see me to say, we have now amassed a debt of 1.8 billion, which isn't bad going over just 4 years. And banks are no longer going to lend to us unless you as mayor agree to underwrite this debt. I told them to piss off. They went into liquidation and we bought the consortium for £1. We brought the work back in-house, but put it all out, individual small projects, to the private sector to bid for. My successor, a hardline Thatcherite Tory, Boris Johnson, even he came to the conclusion this was a mad scheme and bought Bechtel out, giving them nearly £200 million to hand the contract back. But even that, £200 million, he still saved money from these ridiculous contracts. So I have to say, it's important for those in government and running cities to get the balance right between what the state sector can do in investment and the private sector, and not to be confused by that. Fortunately for me, by the time the consortium with its 1.8 billion debt failed, Gordon Brown had become Prime Minister, and as this had been his project and his scheme, the government picked up the bill for that rather than my municipal administration. So I have to say as well, it isn't just in these big projects. I don't know what privatization's been like in Chile, but broadly we've been ripped off. Our energy companies, our private rail firms, our water authority all have incredibly high charges on ordinary people, which of course sucks money out of the economy that would help to create new opportunities and investment. In actual fact, the only one of our privatizations that has been successful was the privatization of British Airways. And that's because British Airways had competition. If they'd increased their prices or reduced the quality of their service, people would have switched to European or American airlines. And of course, if you go back to Adam Smith, I don't think anyone would accuse of being a leftist. He actually wrote that no monopoly should ever be in private hands. And although our energy system was broken up into half a dozen large corporations, broadly they all followed the same pricing policy, and it has not been a success. Another example of pulling the state back has been in housing. When I was first elected in the early 1970s, Britain was building 400,000 new homes a year, a hugely successful construction industry rolling on year after year. When Mrs. Thatcher was elected, she stopped the building of municipal housing, and that 400,000 homes was divided equally. 200,000 each year were built for sale to owner-occupiers. The other 200,000 were handed to councils who used them to rent for lower-income families. The simple fact is the private sector never stepped up to fill the gap created by the public sector not building public housing. Still, up until the banking crisis, we were building 200,000 homes a year, virtually all of them private homes for sale, with the exception of luxury apartments being sold to dodgy Russian criminals and Saudi princes. The private sector never started building homes for ordinary middle and lower income families to rent. And had we carried on building, we would now have nearly 7 million new homes. Even if we'd carried on building just 100,000 homes a year, we'd have 3.5 million. Instead, we have a huge housing crisis. People are now being forced to leave London because they can't afford to live there. I mean, if you want to rent an ordinary 4-bedroom terraced house in not a rich part of London, it will cost you £700 a week, about £35,000 a year. Yet the average wage in London is under £30,000 a year. And in the private rented sector now, which has doubled, not by building new homes for rent, but by people buying up homes which were once owner-occupied and then letting them out. We're now in a position where people living in those private rented homes, over half their income goes to pay the rent. And of course, most people can't do that, so the government introduced housing benefit. So effectively, we spend billions of pounds of taxpayers' money each year to subsidise high rents in the private sector, whereas we could have used that money to carry on building homes and preventing this completely distorted housing market that is doing so much damage. So, getting that role between the state and the private sector right, a genuine partnership between public and private investment, is absolutely crucial to both a city's success and a nation's success. But how can you be certain that the state gets it right? And here is the problem. London Transport was taken under public ownership in 1930 and remained administered by central government bureaucrats in the Department of Transport up until 1970, when it was passed to the Greater London Council. And I remember talking to those officials that were running our transport system. And I remember one of them saying, one of the most senior, however bad our service or however expensive, 90% of our customers have to use it. That didn't suggest to me a particularly helpful approach to providing a public service. And when I became mayor and took over London Underground, within the first year, we had removed 27 of the 30 most senior officials. They were just not dynamic. They'd come into the public sector as civil servants with a bureaucratic mentality. They were risk averse, many of them quite lazy, and they were a disaster. I had to bring in, for the 4 most senior posts in our transport system, I brought 3 successful Americans who'd overseen the construction, the reconstruction and modernization of both the New York and the Boston Underground. And my successor as mayor, although he doesn't agree with me on much, left all those officials in place because they were working. But it wasn't just within that London transport bureaucracy that the system had become so arthritic and sclerotic. It was also in our national government, in our Department of Transport. In my 8 years as mayor, we were promoting a whole range of new schemes. You heard earlier about Crossrail, which will open in 3 years' time, but tube extensions, the upgrade of our inner London northern rail line, massive extensions to the tram system that we have in South London, the biggest range of public investment in our transport system, perhaps since the end of the 19th century. But every single one of those projects was opposed by the officials at the Department of Transport. Every single one. And I had to, in the end, to get these through, work bypassing the officials directly with Gordon Brown's key advisor and effective deputy, Ed Balls. And it wasn't just in recent years. If you look at the history of investment in London Transport, the Victoria Line, which opened in 1969, was first proposed in 1938. The Jubilee Line, which was completed in 2000, was first proposed in 1949. When Crossrail opens in 2018, it was first proposed in 1969. Now, there's something fundamentally wrong with the system of governance, both of politicians and civil servants, that can't take decisions in under 30 to 40 years. And even when you face a decision even more threatening to a city, we had a major flood from the River Thames in 1953, killing thousands of people, massive damage. It was 20 years before the government took a decision to build the Thames Barrier, 20 years. And it finally opened in 1982, only just in time. And later in 1982, we would have had another flood if we hadn't built that barrier. And while I was mayor and we look at the impact of global warming and the rise in sea level, I was arguing that we needed a new, bigger Thames barrier a bit farther out in the estuary by the mid-century. Civil servants will say, oh, we won't need it till at the end of the century, and so on. So, and also, of course, I'm sure you've seen much about the debate about Heathrow Airport. Decade after decade, the failure to create an overall air transport strategy, but taking everything on a one-off, one-by-one decision. And that was the other real success in terms of creating the London mayoral system, which was I was able to create a 20-year plan for London's economy. Following my election, we brought together the business community, trade unions, faith groups, charities, who spent 2 years working out a 20-year growth strategy for London, fundamentally based on investment by both the public and private sector, trying to rebalance our economy away from the predominance of the financial sector into our own little Silicon Valley in the East End, and trying to take a lead in tackling climate change by energy efficiency and alternative energy sources. And that achieved great consensus and was very successful. My successor made a few amendments, but broadly has carried on with it. So I think if I look at, what is the advice you should give governments, it's to devolve powers down to regions and localities. As I said, I thought my 14 years as a Member of Parliament were the least productive of my life, because whether you're a legislator in a presidential system or a parliamentary one, you just pass laws. You don't really run things. And where you do run things, you usually get it wrong. I have watched in my political lifetime every single Secretary of State for Health fail to get a grip on our health service. And that's not surprising. I think after the Chinese army, it's the largest employer in the world. You can't possibly run that from a small handful of politicians and bureaucrats in Westminster. You need a regional and local oversight of our hospitals and our medical system. And the same, I think, should be applied across the board. For me, national government should be dealing with the economy, the military, and what's the other one? Foreign affairs, of course, but devolve everything down. And devolving things down means politicians can actually learn as they work their way up their political career. I mean, I started out at the age of 26, and I made all my worst mistakes in those early years. I was able not to repeat them when I was mayor. But increasingly, our politics in the Western world has been that people come to run countries with no previous experience of running anything. President Obama was a social worker. Tony Blair was a lawyer. And David Cameron was a PR man. None of them had ever actually run anything. Almost no one now moves from business into politics or from a successful career in local government. And so I watched Tony Blair at the age of 44 make the sort of mistakes as Prime Minister that I'd made as a 26-year-old councillor. Fortunately, no one noticed my mistakes, but there was a lot of attention in terms of his. And so I think devolution isn't just good in terms of local democracy and modernising your economy, it also helps to create a better educated group of politicians. And I have to say, I think a lot of China's success comes from the background of their politicians. In the United States Congress, virtually every member of Congress has a law degree. In British Parliament, almost all of them got degrees in politics, philosophy and economics, but most of them dropped the economics to concentrate on the politics and philosophy. A substantial proportion of the Chinese Communist Party's leaders have degrees in engineering, and I think that may have contributed a lot to their success. So the question is, cities, I think, are the answer for getting our success. If you look at one of those particular problems we face, which is climate change, there will be the meeting at the end of this year in Paris, where governments will commit themselves to making changes in the 2020s. But even if they do all those changes, the prediction is that climate change will increase by nearly 3 degrees Celsius. And the warning is anything over 2 degrees is going to be catastrophic. And you, suffering as you occasionally do from El Nino, will know the power of violent weather. But then you look at our great cities. Back in 2005, because I was frustrated that for all the talk about tackling climate change, Tony Blair's government wasn't actually doing anything, I convened a meeting. I invited the mayors of the 20 largest cities on earth to come to London to discuss what we could do in cooperation to tackle climate change. That is now called the C40, and in actual fact, and I know Santiago is a member, 80 cities from around the world are now part of that organisation. They cover 10% of the world's population, 25% of the world's GDP. And none of those mayors really felt they could wait for governments to develop the courage to actually take decisions. And the most significant change we made before I lost the election in 2008 was in 2007, where 16 of those cities agreed that all of us would retrofit every public building in our cities to be energy efficient. Now, what that did, it doubled the world market for retrofitting buildings in that one decision. And the three major companies that lead in retrofitting were able to reduce their prices by 40%. And so I think cities, perhaps just because mayors are closer to the ground, they're not in Parliament discussing laws and arguing about theory, but they have people grabbing them on the street to complain about the state of the roads or the fact that their kid can't get a decent education. They're much more focused on delivery. And the point I conclude on is that, therefore, get the balance right between the public and private sectors. Don't carry on with this bit of neoliberal nonsense that the public sector is just a mistake. It will always get things wrong. Bring in good and talented people, and they will get these things right. But as well as that, we need to challenge public ignorance. Density isn't a problem. The density in London now is increasing because of my abolition of the restrictions on height of density, and London is more successful because of that. As long as you get it right, make sure you have good architects that design good buildings. Make sure that as you increase the density, you release other land for public space. As you increase the density, that concentration of people makes it more efficient and easier to do recycling, more energy efficient, energy supplies, and so on. And I have to say, cities, I think, have been central to the advance of the human race. With the exception of crop rotation, I can't think of any other major human discovery that didn't come from inside our cities, whether it was scientific, economic, or cultural. And that density allows you to provide a much more attractive city. All those people that were moved out of London after the war to often quite nice little towns like Milton Keynes, none of those towns is big enough to sustain the great museums or the orchestras, or that range of cultural offer that is so attractive. We've had a huge increase in tourism in London, but tourists don't come to London to look at our bankers. They come for the cultural offer that is actually there. And it's easier to provide that if you have a good, high population city. And so I end by quoting the very first mayor in human history, because 2,500 years ago in Athens, they decided to have a mayor, and the first mayor was Pericles. And he said, in time, all good things flow towards the city, and the greatest of those is its people. So let's challenge the ignorance and the fear that holds us back from good, inspirational investment and that coalition between the public sector and the private sector that can not just provide a good quality of life for all, but actually can also provide the foundation for tackling life-threatening issues such as climate change. Thank you very much.